Welcome to the Brew Crew Review Podcast, the show by fans for fans of your Milwaukee Brewers. Welcome back, Brewer fans, to podcast number 37. This is Vince Trovato with the Brew Crew Review Podcast, and I am joined today here on the set by Scott Bartell. Scott, how are you tonight?
It could be better, but, I guess, we have our health. There's that.
We do. We're missing a couple of our guys here tonight. Scott, did you talk to Craig Mueller? Do you know where Craig is tonight?
I do not. He said something about going to Taco Bell, which made me think that he was actually going to be taping with us, but because that's usually where he tapes. He sits in the parking lot and tapes from there. And then Chad actually said it's the last night of State Fair, so he's going to be wrapping that up. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think he was out in Chicago earlier today, too, at U.S. Cellular Field for the White Sox game, which is interesting. I don't know if we got the press passes that he did, but apparently he was scouting out potential Brewers trade targets over the offseason in Chicago at the White Sox game today. So that was interesting.
Wonder if he might be scouting, James Shields. He's still there, right?
He is still there, yeah. And you never know. The Brewers, David Stearns, are trying to target here in the next couple of weeks before the August 31st trade deadline. So could be interesting. So in any event, Scott, we just finished another week of Brewers baseball. We're down to it's getting to really be crunch time here. We're approaching mid-August at this taping, and the Brewers, as we sit right now, are still 3 games back behind the Chicago Cubs in the National League Central Division. It was a rough week. We played poorly at home against the San Diego Padres, losing 2 of 3 games. And one of the games, Game 3, was lost in excruciating fashion. We then went and played a series down in Atlanta, where the Brewers also managed to lose 2 of 3 games and lost both series this week to the Padres and the Braves. Just a quick observation on my end. The pitching obviously was a major problem. It seemed like this entire week, and I don't know if this is an example of the Brewers bullpen finally getting overworked and coming down to earth, so to speak, or if it's starting pitching that's a problem, or because the starting pitching has been only average, we now have to deal with a bullpen that, again, has pitched a lot of innings over the course of the season. Scott, give the audience here your thoughts on what happened this past week, losing a series to the last place San Diego Padres and another series to the Atlanta Braves.
Well, I think it's easier to maybe talk about players that are playing really, really, really well right now. Christian Yelich, thanks. He's been hitting 380 for the last month now, and other than that, I really can't think of one Brewer off the top of my head that's playing above expectations right now. So it's a team effort. Unfortunately, that is when you lose and when you win. And we have been losing as of late. We really had a chance to even up, this past week since our last taping. Could have gone 3-3 if we would have won that game against the Braves, but unfortunately, 19 hits and 4 walks just was not enough. And so, gross 2-4 week.
Yeah, it was a rough one here today against the Braves. Kind of a devastating loss as far as I'm concerned. We've had a few of those this week, unfortunately, just these gut-wrenching affairs. And the game today against Atlanta especially bothered me, and I think it's like you said, it's because we got so many contributions on offense, 19 hits. The team scores 7 runs, which isn't awful, and 7 runs should definitely be enough to win a game. But again, we can't seem to match up a solid offensive performance with pitching of any type, and the blame today goes around the entire Brewers pitching rotation, both starting with Chase Anderson, who did not look sharp today. And then going through the bullpen, we saw Corbin Burns give up another couple of runs. We saw the final run of the game coming off of Mr. Jacob Barnes in the bullpen. And another run given up by Corey Knebel. And I really wanted to talk about Corey a little bit because Corey Knebel was obviously very involved in both of our gut-wrenching losses this week. And I don't want to single out one guy for losing a baseball game, but at the same time, I think if we're being honest, I really think that the loss to San Diego in Game 3 this past week really does fall on Knebel's shoulders. The Brewers went into the ninth inning with a lead, and Corey Knebel single-handedly walks the bases loaded, gives up. Let's see. I think he got pulled with the bases loaded. I think it was Soria that gave up the actual grand slam, but still, it was clearly Knebel's game to just lock down at that point against, again, a very weak San Diego Padres team, and wasn't able to do it. And we've seen this kind of throughout the season from Corey where, even on opening day, and I know we talked about it in our pre-production meeting, but he blew a save on opening day, ended up getting the win that game because the Brewers were able to come back in extra innings. Gets hurt shortly thereafter, I think in our next series, or 2 series later against the Cubs. He came back from that injury, and I don't think he's ever looked sharp this year. And it seems like his control is an issue. He can't get the curveball over for a strike. That's an issue. He gives up a ton of home runs, it seems like, walking a lot of batters. I mean, Scott, what do you think, and I know you put this out there on Twitter this week, what do you think is to blame for Corey Knebel's struggles here in 2018, and what do you see for him going forward here for the last month and a half of the season?
Well, I really like Corey Knebel. I mean, if you think about him last year, think about how great Josh Hader was or is this year. That was Corey Knebel last year. Like, Corey Knebel was outstanding last year. In fact, I think I tweeted something like he may have had the best year of any Brewer closer in our team's history. And so it's definitely been a fall from grace. And I actually think when stuff like this happens, I think it's something where they lose their mechanics, and that just makes they can't get he hasn't been able to get his curveball over, and then when he wants to, now he's left with literally throwing nothing but fastballs. And when you do that, I don't care if you can throw 100, it doesn't matter. They're going to tee off on you. And unfortunately, he's actually had trouble locating his fastball as well. And so hence all the walks like in the last time out too. So it's been really rough. I'm going to go so far as to say that not only now is it mechanical, but I think it's getting mental at this point too. Like, I think it's in his head.
I would tend to agree with that at this point too. And, I think that a lot of sabermetricians might mock the idea of a closer's mental toughness, and that not necessarily being a factor, and even looking at the role of closer in a new way as well. But I have to say that, Corey Knebel this year has kind of proven to me that there is a huge mental side of the game, especially with closers, and you've got this guy who's got, like you said, a ton of talent. We've seen his results, and we've seen him, be able to throw several different pitches for strikes. The curveball and the fastball last year were not an issue whatsoever. And I don't think that a guy just loses it overnight. I think a guy can have some mechanical adjustments that he needs to make and can certainly get into bad habits. But that being said, I don't think that a guy completely loses it over the course of one season. And this year, he's just simply not able to get the job done. And I know that we saw a reaction. It was really interesting, Scott. I think that you were the one that brought this up in the pre-production meeting. We talked about how Knebel, even after the game against the Padres in Game 3, perhaps it was physical, but, he's showing the signs that there is a mental aspect too. When he goes off on Brewer fans, essentially on Twitter, by removing a lot of his followers on Twitter. And I think that kind of shows that it is mental. And that to me speaks volumes when a guy isn't able to handle fans discussing his performance. And I understand that a lot of fans are just going to be negative, and it's something that you don't want to read if you're playing on the team. I get that completely, but it seemed like it was a bigger reaction than that, and it does, again, to me, suggest that there is something to the theory that it is a psychological thing with Corey at this point. And what are your thoughts on that, and kind of how that played out after the Brewers lost to the Padres earlier this week?
Yeah, I definitely agree. Unfortunately, it probably says a little something about maybe the mental makeup of your closer. If he blows a save and then goes home and starts blocking people on Twitter, maybe that's not quite the way you want things to go. At the same time, I don't know. It is what it is. The other thing, I guess, that we really have to remember about Corey is, this is this is a young guy who literally like broke into the bigs basically last year, and this is the first time ever in his career then that he's had to overcome these kind of obstacles. He's never really had to have this kind of adversity before, and it's going to be interesting to see how he reacts. I do like that Council hasn't completely given up on him, although I don't necessarily want him in the game with a lead right now, because these wins or lack thereof all these games are pretty important. But at the same time, you can't just shelve him for a week, because that's not going to work either. He's just not going to – he needs to pitch every few days. Simple as that.
Yeah, and Craig Counsell, I mean, just to be clear for our listeners, Craig Counsell did remove him from the closer's role. He didn't necessarily call it a demotion publicly, but he said that he's not going to be pitching in such high leverage situations as the bottom of the ninth inning, perhaps, and closing out games. And we saw it today here in Game 3 in Atlanta that Corey was brought in. I think it was in the sixth inning today. Still a fairly high leverage situation in the sense that it was a close game, but not high leverage in the sense that it was a one-run game in the bottom of the ninth. It was a couple-run game. The differential at that point, the Brewers were ahead, and it was the sixth inning. So we've seen Craig Counsell adjust here midseason. You don't often see that on contending teams or playoff-bound teams, removing a closer essentially in mid-August. So that kind of raised a few red flags to me that says that, Craig Counsell has definitely identified this as being a major problem, and I don't think that a manager does that based on just one game. So obviously with that reaction, I think that the Brewers are saying that they see something a little bit deeper with Knebel at this point, that it's not just a bad game. It's a bad season essentially. And I hate to put it like that, but it really is. And again, I think he's got a lot of talent. He's still young. He can still figure it out, but there have been other guys in the past in the Brewers history of closers that also had issues like this and didn't necessarily come back to succeed. And I hope that that's not the case with Corey going forward. So it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. David Stearns did acquire Joaquin Soria at the trade deadline here. Another guy with closer's experience. Josh Hader has got some experience at closer from when Knebel was injured. Jeremy Jeffers was the Brewers closer in 2016 after we traded Tyler Thornburg, and has been pitching lights out all year. So we do have some other guys. That being said, Soria was injured this week. In the same game as Knebel blew the save, Soria ends up with a groin injury and is removed from the game and has been placed on the disabled list. And I do worry now all of a sudden about our bullpen depth. And I don't know that there's anything that we could have done differently at the deadline. I mean, Stearns did acquire a guy for the pen to add some depth. But how do you think that the bullpen makeup is going to play out here for the next, 6 weeks?
Well, yeah, it's a great point because, I mean, when you think about it, we lose Knebel to the closer's role and we lose Soria to the, possibly the DL. So, I mean, we kind of lost two closers in one fell swoop there. That was a rough inning, right?
Yeah, exactly. And Soria has been put on the disabled list. The Brewers recalled Adrian Hauser for him. Hauser since been already demoted, and we recalled Aaron Wilkerson. So I believe that Wilkerson was a guy on podcasts in the past few weeks who we said we were hoping that the Brewers did not have to call up this year because of needing him because of injury or bad performance. But here he is again, yet one more time in a Brewers uniform here in the 2018 season.
Yeah, I believe it or not. I think that maybe the starters are going to get a little bit longer leash for the next 2-3 weeks here. And after that, I actually think we're going to probably go back to business as usual. I think we're going to have the rosters expand, in September, and then we're going to have plenty of arms in the pen, so we're always going to have a fresh arm. So I think then it's going to take care of itself. Now, unfortunately, we're going to have the quantity. We won't have the quality of a lot of the guys that we're missing now. But, we shouldn't have to worry too much about having the bullpen's arms be taxed.
Yeah, Taylor Williams is due to come off the disabled list here in the next few days, and that'll be interesting to see what roster moves are made. My guess is Wilkerson goes back down at that point for the next few weeks. But even Taylor Williams wasn't very effective, it seemed like, over the past month. It started off pretty well and it struggled in some higher leverage situations again. So we've got a mix of injuries, mixed with guys who are, not stepping up to the plate, so to speak, when when their number is called here during clutch situations this year. We have to see how serious the injury to Soria is. I think that'll be a fairly major factor in the Brewers' success down the stretch here. I do think that we need his depth right now in the bullpen. And, when those rosters expand, I guess I'm trying to figure out who else we're going to call up off the 40-man. We've got, guys like Wilkerson. We've got Brandon Woodruff. But we also still have a ton of injuries that we're probably not going to see resolved anytime soon, maybe with the exception of Zach Davies, who's making a rehab start here, the second one this week. So hopefully Davies can come back and provide a little bit more depth to the overall pitching rotation. But we still have Brent Suter out for the year. We've still got Jimmy Nelson, whose return date is unknown, probably not going to come back this year. I don't think we can count on that, as we discussed in the previous podcast.
Remember when we thought he was going to be back by June? Oof.
Well, the Brewers had even suggested publicly that he could be back in May, and I really am concerned about Jimmy Nelson going forward because, again, if you're originally publicly saying that he could be back as soon as May and will be back by August, essentially, and we've got no timetable yet on his return and barely started throwing off the mound yet, I just don't think that not only can we not count on him for the rest of the 2018 season, but who knows if his 2019 is even in jeopardy at this point, because I just don't see the progress being made, and at least not that's intimated publicly by the Brewers. So our pitching has taken a lot of hits over the past few months. And, unfortunately, our starters, I think, are showing a little wear. Freddie Peralta certainly didn't look sharp his last outing. Chase Anderson does not look very good his last outing. Wade Miley and Julius Chassin are still holding their own, I guess, in the rotation. But, Junior Guerra struggled a little bit. It's just, it seems like a lot of patchwork right now in our pitching staff from top to bottom.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just looking through. I was trying to find a good time to interject with this, I guess. But when you think about closers that were very, very good at one point and then completely just sort of fell off, oh, man, just looking at this list.
Don't say the name. Don't say it, Scott. I know where you're going with this.
Now, there's a bunch of people. I mean, there's so many people that you could actually name. But, I mean, like –
is this somebody that we interviewed in the 2006 season in the Milwaukee Brewers clubhouse who may or may not have had a bobblehead made of real air?
If you're asking, is Derek Turnbull on the list? He absolutely is. But, the funny thing is, I mean, like, okay, so K-Rod wasn't – he kind of lost it a little bit. John Axford lost it a little bit. Salman Torres never had it as a Brewer. Dan Cole, Mike DeJean, Curtis Laskanik, Mike Fetters, Doug Henry.
Eric Gagne, Doug Jones. I mean, it seems like ever since, and I hate to put this out there because this is not a predictor, so to speak, but it's just history and it's kind of what happened. But it seems like ever since Dan Plesac, the Brewers have been able to get like 1 to 2 years of excellent performance out of the closer before he's either traded or goes completely into the tank. And all those names that you just mentioned fall into that category. Dan Plesac left, if I can recall correctly. You can have your intern Sarah look this up, but I think that Dan Cole left after the 1992 season. And after that point, it's been all those guys that you just mentioned, Doug Henry to Mike Fetters to Doug Jones to Bob Wickman to Curtis Laskanik to Mike DeJean to who was like 2000, Danny Kolb to Derek Turnbow to Francisco Cordero to Eric Gagne to Salman Torres to Trevor Hoffman to John Axford to Jim Henderson to Francisco Rodriguez to who was after K-Rod? Was that Thornburg? Maybe? Thornburg to Jeffers, who we traded, to Knable, to whoever our closer is now. I mean, it's just kind of crazy. It seems like none of these guys, and maybe it's just a trend across Major League Baseball, but we're just hyper-focused on the Brewers because we're Brewer fans first and foremost. But it seems like the Brewers have dealt with that a lot over the past, 20 years. It's really interesting.
Well, and see, here's another this is kind of where I was going with that. I just didn't want to depress all of our listeners with, closers that were good and then fell completely apart. But instead, I was actually going to go a different route with this. There's another guy who didn't really do a lot of closing with the Brewers, but he left and then proceeded to completely lose it, fall apart, and then somehow came back to the Brewers and is pitching the best baseball of his life, and that's Jeremy Jeffers. And
right.
I'm kind of wondering if maybe he can hopefully help Knable through this a little bit because Jeffers has been there, and he is definitely somebody who knows what it's like to be up, to be down, and to be back up again. So hopefully he can get Knable really high back to where he was too.
Yeah, that's a great point, Scott. And Jeremy Jeffers, like you pointed out, has certainly seen both the highs and the lows of in his professional career. A number one draft pick by the Brewers back in 2006, I believe. And, he makes his debut briefly with the Brewers in 2010. He's traded to the Royals, struggles there, goes to Toronto, comes back to the Brewers, pitches fairly well in the bullpen. For the Brewers let's see, he's made a closer after Thornburg's traded. He's then traded to Texas, comes back to the Brewers for round 3. That pitch just lights out this year. It's just kind of an incredible story. He's got a couple of suspensions that are mixed in there for a variety of reasons. And but you're right on. Jeremy Jeffers is a guy who has seen some of those ups and downs. You got to really have a form of mental toughness, though, to be able to get through that. Because, I saw a clip of Derek Turnbow recently, and he visited, this wasn't recent, this was like a year or two ago. He visited the Brewers when the Brewers were playing on the road in Seattle, which is apparently where he lives now, or around that area in Washington State. And, Turnbow's like not that far removed from a Major League Baseball career. He's a bigger guy now. He doesn't look like he's in any form of game-playing shape. He's, just far removed. I would really hate to see Corey Knable go down that road, and, we're seeing him 5 years down the road like Turnbow kind of ended up. So I'm hopeful that he takes the Jeffers approach and is still bouncing around and successfully pitching for the Brewers 5 years from now, but you just never know. It's a crazy game sometimes.
Yeah, it really is. I guess right now anyway, we just have to hope that we can put it all together, because unfortunately we are, as you said, getting a little bit late in the season now. We're actually, if you want to break it up into quarters, we are just starting the fourth quarter today, basically, with what do we have, like 41 games to go, something like that?
40. Yep, I think that's right on. 41 games to go. The one thing I'll say, and this could be very good or very bad, is that the Brewers still have a number of games. I believe it's 8 against the Chicago Cubs. So there's lots of room to either improve our positioning against the Cubs or to fall out of the race, essentially, for the division at least. And those in-division rivalry matchups that Major League Baseball seems to schedule in September are going to be very interesting. And that starts next week. We've got we're taping this on Sunday night. The Brewers have an off day tomorrow on Monday. But they started 2-game set against the Cubs on Tuesday and Wednesday at Wrigley Field in Chicago before another off day on Thursday. How do you think that we're going to do in this upcoming Cubs series? It's a 2-gamer, but how do you think we're going to do, Scott?
I can't say I'm looking forward to it. Unfortunately, I'd be happy to get out of there with the split, to be honest. But I guess it would be a real statement if we could find a way to get out of there with both games. But on the other hand, if we lose both of those games, you have to almost start thinking a wild card, because I know that, being the optimistic Brewer fan that I am, I've been looking at the division this entire time, and now all of a sudden, the Cubs are starting to pull away just a little bit, and more importantly, the rest of the pack has basically caught up to the Brewers. I mean, there are many teams now in the wild card. Like, it's not like the Brewers are going to be able to just play 500 ball the rest of the way and get into the playoffs. I just don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah, it's a tough division. It always has been. The Cardinals are obviously a little weaker than previous seasons. They've had a lot of turmoil in St. Louis this year with their firing of Mike Matheny as their manager, and they've made a number of trades out of their bullpen and traded Tommy Pham at the deadline. So they've had a number of changes there. But the Pirates have managed to hang tough for most of the year, longer than I expected them to. And you're right. I mean, I started thinking today when we lost that game to the Braves that, well, at least we have won the season series against Atlanta if it comes down to that in a wild card head-to-head, and we're talking home field advantage in the playoffs. And I don't want to think like that. I'd like to think that the Brewers are still able to compete for the division. The Cubs did lose last night to the Nationals in Chicago, so that was good for the Brewers as we picked up at least the one win against Atlanta. But that being said, again, I think a lot of it's just going to come down to these head-to-head Cubs matchups against the Brewers. And we're unfortunately 3-8 against the Cubs this year. They really had our number. And we had a number of those games, it was very frustrating losses. A couple of games we just got blown out. I remember one game first series against the Cubs at Miller Park this year. I think it was an 8-0 game in their first matchup this year. And I just want the Brewers to somehow be able to get past this awful week of just losing baseball against, the dregs of the National League West and the Padres and then the Braves and come back fighting against the Cubs on Tuesday. And we'll see what kind of character this team has and how they're able to bounce back from this. We saw the Brewers obviously have a huge swoon right before the All-Star game, managed to lose 7 or 8 in a row. And since the All-Star game, we managed to play pretty decently again until this past week. And, we were, I think, all optimistic after the Brewers had played fairly well against the Giants and Dodgers on the West Coast trip and at least didn't, get completely bounced from the race or talk of playoffs. And we just come back for just an awful week against these two teams. So it's pretty disheartening. But let's hope once again that the Brewers can find their footing. Every team goes through stretches in a year. You'd just like to say that, at this point, I think what can definitely be said is that the Brewers cannot really afford another long bad stretch. And if it ends here, then it ends here. And, every team kind of goes through a couple stretches during the course of a long season, but it has to end here. We can't continue to play bad against the Cubs and then to play bad against the Cardinals when we go on the road to St. Louis after the Cubs series, and it just has to end. So we all worry about the tailspin, I think, as Brewer fans after witnessing, 2017 and 2014, and it's frustrating. So I think that this week was a downer, but we'll see how we bounce back.
Well, and now here's the other thing. I mean, if let's be a little pessimistic for just 1 second. If the Brewers wind up not making the playoffs this year, I would think that at this point anyway, we would definitely look back at getting swept a 5-game series sweep right before the All-Star game, like you said, to the Pittsburgh Pirates, who definitely have had our number all year. And not only is that a 5-game swing between them and us, but it winds up having like this, effect later down the season, because here's what happens then. The Pirates are playing good baseball at the time. They think, hey, you know what? We just crawled back into this. Instead of selling off our parts, let's go out and get Chris Archer. Chris Archer, who the Brewers were looking at the whole time, and for all we know, maybe Pittsburgh was the only team that beat us out for him. Maybe Chris Archer is a Brewer right now if we don't get swept in 5 games by that season or in that series. And not only that, for our last 41 games, 9 of those are against Pittsburgh. So now, obviously you're going to play a much better Pittsburgh team who decided that they were actually going to buy in and go for it a little bit this year instead of selling off. So it's going to have a real bad effect for the rest of the year, and it's all going to come back to that series. So we really
not only that, but how are the Pirates not confident going into playing the Brewers? At this point, after they've handled this so well this season, and not only that, but to me, the worst thing about that whole week, and you might be onto something actually, the worst part probably being that the Pirates were acquiring talent instead of trading away assets. But to me, at the time at least, the worst thing about that week was that the Brewers were losing badly while the Cubs went on a roll. And they were like 9-1 or something during that 10-game stretch where the Brewers were 2-8. And the timing just couldn't have been any worse. We not only didn't maintain our position in the division, but we lost ground every single day against the Cubs, it seemed like, for that span, and it was just awful. So it's 3-4 weeks since then now, 3.5 weeks since then, and I'm hopeful that the Brewers are not going into another tailspin this close to that one, and we've got to hope that that's true. But again, this past week has been discouraging on a number of fronts. I know that our anonymous source, Tom Carter, he says that he thinks that the Brewers are still in it. He's usually a beacon of optimism, so you take that with a grain of salt. But our anonymous source, Tom Carter, said he still thinks that the Brewers have got enough depth at different positions to be able to maintain their position here in the race, and it's really going to come down to the last week of the season, and we're not going to be eliminated anytime before that. I don't know if that's true or not. What do you think about what our anonymous source, Tom Carter, said?
Well, believe it or not, Tom, despite the fact that he works at the Brewers and is always giving us this great information, you would think that he is, maybe always drinking the Kool-Aid just, because he works there and stuff like that. But believe it or not, Tom is a pretty level-headed guy. He's always a realist, and If he says it, I believe it. Simple as that.
I mean, fair enough. Tom Carter is a smart guy, so that makes some sense. But well, how do you think that the Brewers are going to fare? We talked a little bit about the Cubs, but we also go on the road then to St. Louis following the Cubs series. We do have a day off on Thursday, so I guess one positive right now is the Brewers have played a lot of games in the first half, especially, and more so than our divisional opponents, and that means more off days here in the second half than we had in the first half, including 2 this week. So we've got an off day tomorrow on Monday and again another off day on Thursday. But how do you think the Brewers are going to fare in that series in St. Louis that starts on Friday night?
I just don't know at this point what Brewer team is going to show up. I mean, like you were saying, actually, believe it or not, we are still projected to have a 64% chance of making the playoffs. And I think if you asked like your average Milwaukee Brewer fan right now, they'd say 20, 25%. So it's been a little tough.
There's a lot of ghosts of seasons past floating around in Milwaukee. So it's not always the easiest to be an optimistic Brewers fan, I think, as we're seeing from some of our Twitter followers here in the last few days. It certainly has been an interesting exercise in logic versus passion the past week, I would say. But
meanwhile, let's look at your typical Cardinal fan who, up until last week probably, wasn't really thinking about anything. I guess they were looking forward to St. Louis Rams football. Oh, I don't know what you look forward to. You're in St. Louis once football season starts.
People go and visit your favorite spot in the United States at that arch, Scott. That's where they go. That's what they do.
Yeah, that's wonderful. But no, the Cardinals, up until last week, they were only 3 games over 500. Their season's almost over. Then this week, they don't lose. So now they're 8 games over 500. They're only a couple games behind us for the wild card. So now, look at it.
And I hate to bring this up in the same podcast where we talk about the ghosts of Derek Turnbow and Mike Dejan, but the Cardinals have obviously given us a lot of trouble over the years. 2 of our 4 playoff appearances as a franchise were ended by the Cardinals. They seem to have our number all the time. Yadier Molina to not make it out against us, it seems like, and it's discouraging to think that if the Brewers aren't truly going into a tailspin, I hate to use that word, but if we are, the fact that the St. Louis Cardinals could put the proverbial icing on the cake is beyond maddening this year. And I guess the last question I have, I know we're getting a little short on time here on this podcast, but the last question I have on this is if the Brewers, God forbid, do miss the postseason this year after being in first place literally on the first of every month of the entire season, April, May, June, July, August, we've been in first place on that day every single month of the season. If the Brewers do miss the playoffs this year, do you think that there's going to be a bit more of an anti-Stearns or anti-Craig Counsell or anti-Mark Adamowski? Do you think there's going to be some reaction from the fans this year? Do you think that most fans are kind of looking at 2018 and saying, we overperformed for sure in 2017. 2018, we had a chance, but it was still kind of a see what you got, a lot of young guys type of year? Or do you think that fans are going to be pissed off and say, we've got a team that should be a playoff contender. We're not making the acquisitions we need to make at the deadline. We're not getting guys that are in positions of need, like a starting pitcher, and taking the route that a lot of fans were taking on social media this week was to kind of lash out at the Brewers for a variety of reasons. I think that not acquiring a starting pitcher was number one amongst fans' beef. There were some concerns about Craig Counsell's in-game management with the Knebel situation. I'm not saying that those guys are meriting that criticism, but I'm just wondering what your take is about, what kind of the fan reaction is going to be in the offseason to Stearns and Counsell if we don't make the playoffs.
To be perfectly honest, I think myself as a fan, I think that our fan base tends to overreact to a lot of this stuff. And I think that unfortunately, right or wrong, this is a fan base that wants to see results. We want to go to the playoffs. And, we haven't had a lot of opportunities to do that in, 50 years of this franchise. So I totally understand it. I mean, it's kind of like the fans are sort of fed up, I guess. And I think if anything, Stearns is a little bit, I guess the thing is that a rebuild is supposed to be what, 3 years, 4 years, something like that. If you're the Marlins, 8 years, but they have 2 World Series championships, so you can't say too much. But I think what happened is we had basically one bad year, and or 1 or 2, and that's it. And now, like Stearns, since the time Stearns took over, he basically had a 1-year rebuild, and now the team's been really, really in contention all of last year and all of this year, and unfortunately, yeah, that's where we're at. If you look at what Stearns has done though for this team, he's done so much. I mean, Kane and Yelich are by far our best 2 players on our team. If you're looking at
right.
or something like that. And to be honest, just rattling it down, it's Kane, Yelich, Shaw, Aguiar, Hader, Chacin, Jeffers. I mean, these are all guys that he went out and got. And he's really, I think this team has overachieved. I think they overachieved last year. I think they're overachieving this year. And it's not Stearns' fault that maybe the team's playing over their head, but I like that he's not mortgaging the future to try to get like 1 year and then have to rebuild all over again. So.
Yeah, and I tend to really defend Stearns and Counsell as well. I mean, like every fan, I think that I wish that we would have acquired a starting pitcher at the deadline. And that being said, we talked about it on other podcasts. I literally don't see any options that the Brewers had at the deadline without, as you mentioned, mortgaging the future. And I don't think that we really had a full complement of guys that we necessarily could have gone after. So I tend to think that we're saving our chips for either a top of the rotation arm this offseason, or we're going to use those guys to plug in holes in our major league roster anyways. But if you unloaded say 3 of our top 10 prospects for a guy like Chris Archer, I think it would be making a huge mistake. So I tend to give Stearns really the benefit of the doubt on a lot of things. And I don't think this is on him by any stretch. So I agree with you. I only brought it up because I think a number of our fans were kind of talking about it on social media this week. And one of the things, for Counsell, I really don't know what else he was supposed to do, but throwing Knebel in that game in the 9th. And I guess in theory, after he walks 2 guys, you maybe go get him. But I'm not going to hold, 1 extra batter against Craig Counsell and all that he's done for the franchise yet. So I think the fans need to be a little bit more patient. It's hard to say for a team that is going into their 50th year in Milwaukee here in 2019, and we've got 4 playoff appearances. But that being said, I really do think that with this management team in place, that we've got a good thing going, and we don't want to rock the boat too much on that. So, yeah, it's good stuff, Scott. I think that's a good analysis.
Yeah, it's probably possible that Stearns' best moves right now are the ones that he's not making versus the ones that he is.
Right.
When you look at starters in the offseason, I remember I was saying, yeah, we should really go get Alex Cobb, and that didn't work. And Lance Lynn was really good. Hugh Darvish has been hurt / a train wreck.
And I think Jake Arrieta's numbers are kind of where we expected them to be. But again, if you're the Brewers, you play in one of the smallest markets in Major League Baseball. Do you want to be handing out a 5-year contract to a guy who's 34 already? And I don't think that that's necessarily the direction that the Brewers want to go. And I don't think that Stearns made a mistake in not pursuing the guys that you just listed either. And I do think he's obviously actively exploring, who's available. I know that Craig really likes Wade Miley, and he also really likes Kevin Gausman. He's glad that we picked up Miley, but he was upset that we didn't get Gausman. And I tend to think that maybe that would have been a decent arm to target. But that being said, I don't think he necessarily moves the needle a ton this season, and I don't think that it's necessarily a guy that we could have acquired for fairly cheap. And there's differing approaches on how you value the prospects that the Braves gave up to the Orioles for Gausman. But number one, it's hard to compare systems because the Braves just had such a good system. And number two, because of that great system, they had a lot of surplus that they really could deal from. And I don't know if the Brewers want to put all their chips on the table unless it's for a top of the rotation arm. If a DeGrom was become available, yeah, that's a different animal than a Kevin Gausman, in my opinion.
Right.
it's interesting to say the least. But
Well, and
anyways, just kind of the talk of social media this week.
all those names that that we just listed, and who's pitching better than them? Well, like you mentioned, Chassin, Wade Miley. You know who else did another under the radar move that just was better than any of those free agent signings was the Cardinals with Miles Mikolas. So
Yep.
I don't know.
Yep.
I mean,
and we've seen teams like the Cubs spend a lot of money on their starting rotation and get guys like Tyler Chatwood, who's had a horrible year, and Yu Darvish, who's been hurt or awful all year. And, it's not necessarily the key to success isn't necessarily spending a lot of money on these guys. It's finding the right guys and bringing them in for the right price. And I think that's really the balance that Stearns has found in a way, and we'll see what he does this offseason. I think that it'll be interesting with this year's free agent class or potentially other names that are available via trade in the offseason that weren't available at the deadline. But certainly will be interesting. So
yeah, and Chicago can do that, and they can shell out the money for that because there is no revenue sharing really in baseball. I mean, this isn't like the NFL where everybody splits everything evenly basically. If MLB was ran the same way, or if the NFL was ran that way, then the Packers or Green Bay, Wisconsin wouldn't even have a franchise. So
yeah, and in a perfect world, we go out and we get somebody like I know that you and Craig both like him a lot. I do too, Cole Hamels, but again, I don't think the Cubs can afford to get him. Number one, they didn't. Hamels didn't have a no trade clause to the Cubs, and number two, again, if the Brewers had to convince Hamels to waive a no trade clause, I don't think he does that without the Brewers exercising a $20 million option for 2019. And I don't think that a team like the Brewers financially is able to be in that position to guarantee that type of money to an older pitcher who's had, let's face it, mixed results the last couple of years. And some of those results not very good at all, or certainly not better than what we currently have. So, it's an interesting situation.
If we would have signed Yu Darvish to the money that the Cubs gave him, our franchise would be crippled for like the next 3 years. All of a sudden, we'll go back into rebuild mode.
Right. It was bad enough with a guy like Suppan, who was for 4 years and way less money than what it cost to get Darvish in both years and money. And I think you're spot on. I don't think the Brewers can afford to do anything like that. The thing with the Brewers is we can afford to give a contract with that dollar amount to a guy like Darvish. The problem is that we can't afford to give multiple ones, and we certainly can't afford to make a mistake. So if you're going to spend that money, they all have to hit for that to be worth it. And you can't have a mistake. Whereas the Cubs, if Darvish never performs, that sucks for the Cubs, but it's not going to cripple their whole franchise. Whereas with the Brewers, it certainly does. And Stearns has got to be aware of that. He is aware of that. And it certainly has to take that into account. So I get it completely.
Yeah, I mean, look at our most expensive player right now in Ryan Braun. And he's not crippling the franchise, although if he wasn't on the roster, we'd have enough payroll free that maybe we would have made one of those moves. And Ryan Braun, unfortunately, his WAR this year so far is 0.5. To give you an idea how bad that is, especially compared to Ryan Braun in previous years.
Right.
Keon Broxton in his, probably 100 at-bats, if that, this year, was a 0.9. So Keon Broxton was almost double the value of Braun this year.
And I certainly agree that contract has an effect on the Brewers, but I'll also say that, that contract was in 2011 dollars. So imagine making that mistake with 2018 dollars on a guy, and for more money. So
yep.
To me, that's the nuts and bolts of it, so to speak. So again, I think you got to give Stearns some credit for putting together a very competitive roster without those types of resources that they have in Chicago, and we'll see what happens here. It's going to be an interesting couple of months. All right, Scott, it looks like we've used up our time here on this podcast. I do want to remind fans to continue to send in your questions. We'll get to them on the next podcast. Our email address is brewcrewreviewpodcasts with an S at gmail.com. Brewcrewreviewpodcasts with an S at gmail.com. Scott, do you want to give our fans the Twitter homepage again?
Yep. Go to Twitter. We're at Brew Crew Review and then the number 1. Go ahead. Actually, if you could find it, if you can follow, and subscribe a certain tweet that we sent out, you'll be automatically entered into a drawing for a Ricky Weeks signed baseball. It's pretty exciting. All you have to do is click buttons. Not very difficult.
Yep. our social media interns have done a great job this week on getting out there. The prize this week again are Ricky Weeks Autographed Baseball, so make sure you like, subscribe, and retweet for a chance to win that, and there will be more prizes in the weeks ahead. So we thank all of our followers. I know we've actually added quite a few here this past week, which is great news. Thanks to our interns, Sarah and Kelly, for their help this week, and thanks to our anonymous source, Tom Carter, for all the insights.
Thanks, Tom.
And thanks, Tom, and thanks, Chad and Craig, for the thanks for
Tom.
Thanks for the pre.
T. Carter.
Yeah. T. Carter. Oh, yeah, that's right. Anonymous. But thanks again to our co-hosts, Craig and Chad, for all their insights here over the past week. Hopefully they can join us on our next podcast. So in the meantime, remember to stay classy, Milwaukee, and go Brewers.
Stay classy. Go Brewers. Big series this week. Big road trip.
That's it. Go
2
Brewers.
Cubs games. 3 Cardinals games.
Thanks, Scott. Take care.
All right. Take care.
Go Brewers.